Hello, my name is Shawnee Vanderpool, and I'll be going deeper into Apple's link to modern slavery in Congo and labor exploitation globally. There are three main points that I'll be covering in my presentation, which is the purpose, the problem, and my recommendation. The purpose is to have myself and the class to analyze Apple's involvement in modern slavery and labor exploitation. Later, I'll discuss deeper into the cases such as the Foxconn case in Chinese factories and the cobalt mines in Congo, also known as the DRC. The problem is discussing further into the fact of whether Apple should be held responsible for their global supply chain, as many cases of child labor, unsafe working environments, suicides, and unfair wages have been filed throughout the year. Lastly, my recommendation will cover my possible solutions that I have for Apple in order to improve their labor conditions, source materials that have no connection to child labor, and overall have stricter policies on enforcing these conditions. For my overview, I will start with the ethical question, and then I'll introduce the case studies that have happened in the past and are currently happening right now. I'll make sure to list primary and secondary stakeholders, then I'll provide my solutions and the recommendation that I have with limitations. And then I'll describe how this affects each stakeholder group. Lastly, I will cover the obstacles that these solutions will bring and reflection on my bias. My ethical question is, should it be acceptable for technology companies like Apple to profit from their products that have been sourced through exploitative labor practices? And should Apple invest more into ensuring fair wages and labor practices for the countries contributing to Apple's supply chain and manufacturing? How many of you own or know someone who owns an Apple product? Raise your hand. At least 99% of you would raise your hands. This tech company has had their consumers eagerly awaiting for each new iPhone release, as it has the latest updates and features. But all these phones come with a cost. And I'm not talking about the cost in price, but the cost of workers being forced to endure unsafe environments when mining conflict minerals in order to supply Apple with materials it needs. So those materials are later transferred and then sent to factories where many employees are victims to long hours, low wages, and unfair treatment as well. This case is a smaller part of my argument, but I think it's crucial to show the effects that Apple has had on their suppliers and how those suppliers applied that pressure to treat their employees terribly. The workers at Foxconn were being paid very low in wages for the long amount of time they were made to work, with not much rest. Fatigue slowly was building up, and it started affecting their mental health. Seeing that these workers weren't able to get out of their factories, let alone sleep, and having to keep on working, it's no wonder why their anxiety and their mental health started to get worse. Sadly, 18 victims took their lives as they could no longer keep up with the fast-paced deadlines. Modern slavery in the DRC. So these cases are still happening right now in the cobalt mining industry in Congo, who supply their minerals for batteries, phones, electronics for tech companies like Apple or their competitors. Some of you may have recently heard of what's been happening in Congo, or some of you are probably only hearing about this now for the first time. The issue of human rights and modern slavery happening in Congo has been officially known since the early 2000s. It wasn't technically there wasn't no laws until 2010, such as the Dodd-Frank Act, which was created in order to protect human rights, whether it was in the US or globally. The DRC actually filed criminal complaints, even right now, to Apple, but Apple has been denying for years that their suppliers are not connected to any of these conflicts. But it's hard to accept that, as these files are still being sent in against Apple and their competitors. Now I'll give the class a point of view of what it's like for miners in the cobalt industry. Without a flashlight, this is all the miners see. Even with a flashlight, it's still kind of hard to see. You can tell that it's very small, narrow, and it's just very tight to fit in there. For miners, they fear for their lives every time they go to work. The ceilings of the mines aren't the best as they get very fragile, and those big chunks of stone, rock, and minerals start falling once the supports and the ceiling gets very weak. Minor injuries consist of broken arms and legs if they're lucky. Worst case scenarios, and most of the times, the usual outcome is death. But miners can't really do anything about this as they have to feed their families, so they have no choice but to go back in every day. The next part of the process are the transporters. There are some cars here and there, but that's usually the case for workers if they're financially lucky. Most of the workers only have bikes that they've been conditioning for years. Once the bike breaks down, they no longer have a job in a sense, as their bike is their job. So they have to make sure to condition their bikes. The transporters bring the bag of minerals to the washers. The washer's job is to take the bags and then bring it into the water and stomp on it until the ores, like in the ores, there's no soil left. As you can see on the screen, one bag is considered $3.75. Most workers start at 8 a.m. And so assuming that they have like a 12-hour shift that day, they would only be making around $15.63 an hour if they were able to wash 50 bags. Having to crouch in that position for 12 hours would it reflects the amount of effort that everyone is putting into their jobs. And it's also very sad to see because they're getting paid very little. I have one more point to add for the washers. And so when they wash minerals, they're exposed to uranium, and that's extremely toxic for the human body. Doctors ended up finding out that pregnant women who worked as washers had the highest concentrations of heavy metal in their blood ever recorded. The last process is when the minerals that are washed are sent to be bought from international companies. Here, workers really have no say in the pricing since companies kind of force a price on them. And if the workers don't agree with that price, most cases the companies will refuse to buy from them. And so that's no profit for the workers as they aren't able to sell their minerals, which is pretty unfair. Primary stakeholders in these cases are the workers in Congo and the workers globally as they produce the conflict minerals and put the product together. Apple is also another primary stakeholder as they rely on the minerals that are mined in the DRC and produced in factories like China. Consumers are also a primary stakeholder as they bring a huge profit to Apple. If consumers knew more about what their products contained and how it was produced, it could impact their decision on whether or not they want to keep on buying from Apple. Lastly, suppliers are a primary stakeholder as they are the source of Apple getting the materials that are needed. If the suppliers are gone, Apple's supply chain would be in chaos. Secondary stakeholders are the resource dependent communities, which are communities that live around the mines. Many families actually move closer to the mines as they are in need of jobs, and the mines can provide them with that as many tend to lose their lives. Competitors like Samsung or Microsoft are also secondary stakeholders because within the tech market, their ways of operating and rules can affect the overall business as customers would compare Apple and the competitors. Lastly is the media. Um, they receive information on the company and then report it to the audience. So Apple could either get a positive or a negative impact based on how the media states and reports on them. Apple's solution to the Foxconn case was to set more safety standards for their employees. In order to improve their labor management of their suppliers, they actually ended up getting help from world experts, so they got feedback on possible solutions that they can better improve on. The issue with workers being overworked, Apple decided to publish work hour data from their supply chain to the public. While the solution was in the right direction, many still think that Apple could have done a lot more better or could compromise with their suppliers to and support them better. For Apple's conflict minerals, in the report in 2023, Apple did acknowledge what minerals they used, and they claimed that they are identifying risks, so they see if they're connected to any of these conflicts in their supply chain. They do currently have a plan of recycling their conflict minerals, but that's like set up until 2030, so it's still about like 5-ish years away. But it will take a lot of time and money, and if they did have this plan already, it would have been done right now, but it's really complicated. My first solution is with the recycling system that Apple has mentioned, and then also sending out inspectors and then having an additional safety training to be taken place in order to prevent any deaths or injuries. Limitations could be pretty costly. The suppliers may not agree with a lot of the safety training and the inspectors coming over. My second solution is Apple fully acknowledging what materials they use, and they should know where it comes from, as the suppliers have that exact information of where they got their minerals. Not only that, it's to make sure that no child labor is happening or is conflicted with those minerals. Inspectors must check that the suppliers are following this policy. Another thing for Apple is I think they should create a program for children, like education or funds, so that the children don't have to rely on working at such a young age. When inspectors are sent, they should also look into if employees are being paid fairly, and that I think that Apple should work with the suppliers and negotiate like payment agreements. Lastly, with the solution, I think that protective equipment for the workers can improve their health and help them in dangerous situations. The limitations for this is that it's still pretty costly, and the suppliers may not agree with the payments and overall if they want to use the safety equipment. And then there's also the fact that there are laws in each country that can vary, and so that would be pretty difficult. I chose solution 2 as I believe that it will create a better impact. In this case, the winners would be the workers, the media, and resource dependent communities. With better safety gear, their health would improve. Miners wouldn't have to worry about their just being scared to go in all the time into the mines. And then women wouldn't have to worry about chemicals entering their bodies if they had that equipment. And I think the media would profit either way because they have this information and they could gain the attention of the people. For the mixed, I would say Apple, the competitors who decided adopt a similar solution, and then consumers. Apple would be mixed because they would be paying a lot, and so that would be a negative side into sticking with a solution, but they can also gain the attraction of customers where customers would be like, oh, Apple's actually doing something about this issue. Um, and so for consumers, they could see this as either something they like or not. So it depends on the consumer or the customer. For competitors who decide to have this similar solution, I would say that it would be a plus side to them because when they get compared to Apple, they're also doing a similar solution. And so consumers would be like, oh, they care about this issue as well. And so it could be a plus side to the competitors. For the losers, suppliers would have to pay a lot, and overall, everything would just be a negative part on them. And then for competitors who decide not to act, again, they would be compared to Apple, and then so it would be like a negative impact. In order to overcome the costs, Apple can create funds, work with organizations, or just bring awareness to the situation. Apple would have to pay more for the suppliers, as they could either come up with multiple negotiations or by, again, paying to help the suppliers financially. Lastly, for laws, Apple would have to overcome this by negotiating again and also working with global organizations. Once the world sees that they're doing this for human right abuses and so that everything is people are getting paid equally, I think that this would be a good solution. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that my bias can be used in this case as I am an Apple user myself. Whether I might buy another product in the future, I'm still unsure of, but there are possibilities. I also need to acknowledge that my views could have been swayed as I've been watching these cases over the years, and so it could be affected by that. And then it's my works cited. Thank you. And then questions.